She was 21 years old when she married him, an Irish Catholic girl from Brooklyn who had grown up going to Mass on Sundays and working in a factory to keep her family afloat after her father died. She had her whole life ahead of her. By the time she was 28, her hair had turned completely grey, not gradually, all at once, from stress. May Capone spent nearly 7 decades living inside the consequences of one decision, the decision to stay. Through the bootlegging empire, the infidelities, the disease her husband passed to her and to their son, the prison years, the slow deterioration of the man she had married, and the long, quiet decades that followed his death. She never left. She never remarried. She never gave an interview. The world knows Al Capone. Almost no one knows what it actually cost to be his wife. Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, and the girl nobody saw coming. The story of May Capone begins long before Al Capone, in the specific world of the working-class Irish-American immigrant community of Brooklyn, New York, in the 1890s and early 1900s. A world organized around the parish, the neighborhood, and the specific survival logic of people who had crossed an ocean with very little and were building something from scratch on the other side. Mary Josephine Coughlin was born on April 11, 1897, in Brooklyn, the daughter of Michael Coughlin and Bridget Gorman, both of whom had immigrated separately from Ireland in the 1890s and met in New York. Michael was a laborer. Bridget did housework. They were the specific kind of people who are entirely invisible in history until one of their children does something that makes the historians come looking backward. Not because they were unremarkable people, but because the machinery of the historical record was not designed to capture working-class Irish immigrant families going about the daily business of survival. May grew up in a household organized around work and faith and the specific rhythms of the Brooklyn Irish Catholic community. She was, by the accounts of people who knew the family, a serious and capable girl, someone who took school seriously and possessed the specific quality of careful intelligence that makes a person an excellent reader of other people and of situations. She graduated from high school, which in the early 1900s was genuinely uncommon for women of her class and background. It was an accomplishment that distinguished her in her world, and it is one of the details that has followed every account of her life ever since. The fact that she was more educated than the man she eventually chose. Her father died when she was young, and the death reorganized the family's already precarious financial situation. May left school at 16 to work in a box factory, bringing her wages home to help support her mother and siblings. The factory job was not unusual for young women of her background in that era. It was the specific kind of labor that the immigrant working class relied on, the kind of work that left no room for ambition beyond the immediate necessity of keeping the family solvent. She was doing this work, going to the factory, coming home, attending Mass, navigating the specific social world of the Carroll Gardens neighborhood, when she encountered Alphonse Capone. Carroll Gardens was, in the early decades of the 20th century, one of the most densely Irish neighborhoods in Brooklyn, a place of row houses and church spires, and the specific tight community architecture of immigrant populations that maintain their cultural identity in the face of the larger city around them. The Irish and the Italians in Brooklyn were not always friendly communities. The gang rivalries that ran along ethnic lines were a persistent fact of urban life in that era, and a young woman from the Carroll Gardens Irish community would not normally have been expected to find a romantic partner in the Italian immigrant world. That May did, and that both families apparently accepted the situation without significant resistance, says something about the specific practical logic of how the two communities negotiated the boundaries between them when circumstances required it. Exactly how they met has never been definitively established. Some accounts say they met at a party in the neighborhood. Others say that Al's mother, Teresina Capone, who was a seamstress, knew May from church and arranged the introduction herself. What is established is that Al Capone was 18 years old when they met, and May was 20, 2 years older than the man who would eventually become the most powerful criminal in America. Those 2 years mattered enough to May that she took steps to obscure them. When they married, the marriage certificate recorded both of their ages as 20. Al had added a year to his actual age. May had subtracted 2 years from hers. The arithmetic was deliberate. She was not embarrassed by the relationship. She was simply someone who understood, from the beginning, that managing the public version of a story was sometimes necessary, a quality that would serve her well for the next 7 decades. The Capone who changed everything. Al Capone was, in the years when May first knew him, still in the early stages of becoming what he eventually became. He had grown up in Brooklyn in a Neapolitan immigrant family, his father Gabriel a barber, his mother Teresa a seamstress, who held the household together with the specific fierce competence of a woman who had done difficult things and expected the same from her children. Al was the fourth of 9 children, and he had dropped out of school at 14 after striking a teacher who had hit him first. By the time he met May, he was working for the Brooklyn criminal figure Frankie Yale at a Coney Island establishment called the Harvard Inn, first as a bartender, then in the broader capacity of someone whose usefulness extended beyond mixing drinks. The Harvard Inn was also where Capone received the scars on his left cheek that would give him the nickname Scarface. He had made a remark to a woman at the bar that her brother considered an insult, and her brother responded by slashing him across the face with a knife on 3 separate strokes. The scars were permanent. Capone spent the rest of his life claiming they were war wounds from the fighting in France. He was not in the war. What May saw in this young man, who had no formal education, who was already enmeshed in criminal activity, who was 2 years younger than she was and substantially less educated, is something she never publicly explained. The accounts of people who knew them in those years describe someone who was genuinely charming in a way that photographs don't fully capture, who had a quality of physical confidence and personal warmth that could fill a room. He could make whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person present. That quality of magnetic personal presence was real, and it was the thing that would eventually make him the most influential man in Chicago and the most recognized criminal in American history. The social calculus of their union was noted by the community around them. May was considered to be marrying down. She was more educated. She was Irish and Catholic, in a context where that identity carried a particular kind of respectability, and the young man she was choosing was clearly already moving in criminal circles. Al, by contrast, was considered to be marrying up, getting a wife whose education and background exceeded his own in ways that the Italian immigrant community of that era valued. Their union also had a practical social function. Irish-Italian gang rivalries in Brooklyn were a constant source of violence, and a marriage that connected the two communities was, from certain angles, a useful arrangement. The relationship moved quickly. May became pregnant. Sonny Capone was born on December 4th, 1918. Albert Francis Capone, the only child the two of them would ever have together. 3 weeks after Sonny's birth, on December 30th, 1918, May and Al were married at St. Mary Star of the Sea Church in Brooklyn. Al was under 21, and his parents had to give written consent to the marriage. The community knew them. The priest knew them. It was a neighborhood wedding. What neither the community nor the priest nor May herself fully understood was the chain of consequences that was already in motion. Sonny, the disease, and the weight nobody spoke about. The most devastating fact about May Capone's marriage is not the infidelities, though those were real and ongoing. It is not the imprisonment, though that remade her life entirely. It is something that touched her son before she fully understood who she had married, something that ran through the rest of her life like a current through water. Sonny Capone was born with congenital syphilis. The disease was transmitted from Al, who had contracted it through the continuous pattern of relationships outside his marriage that he maintained from early in his adult life and made very little effort to conceal. Syphilis transmitted to a child in the womb is a serious condition that attacks multiple body systems, and Sonny's infection manifested in a severe mastoid infection, a dangerous inflammation of the bone behind the ear that required emergency brain surgery when he was a young child. He survived the surgery. He was left permanently partially deaf in one ear. The hearing loss was something he managed for the rest of his life. May and Al traveled from Chicago to New York specifically to get Sonny the best possible medical care available. Al Capone had, by the time of Sonny's illness, already established the family in Chicago and was building what would become the most profitable criminal organization in American history. He dropped everything to take his son to the best doctors. People who want to understand Al Capone as a complete person, rather than simply as a symbol of organized crime, often point to moments like this. The man who ordered violence as a business tool was the same man who traveled across the country for his sick child. But the disease did not stop with Sonny. The medical evidence, drawn from the pattern of May's subsequent pregnancies, indicates that she had contracted syphilis from Al at some point during the marriage. She and Al tried to have more children after Sonny. The pregnancies that followed resulted in stillbirths and miscarriages. The disease that Al had brought home from his life outside the marriage had taken from May the children she might otherwise have had. She raised Sonny as an only child, in the specific way of women who have experienced that kind of loss, with a fierce and total devotion that carried within it the weight of everything that had not survived. May reportedly told Sonny, years later, the most direct thing she ever said about what the marriage had cost her personally. She told him not to do what his father had done. She told him his father had broken her heart. It is one of the only direct statements attributed to her in the entire historical record. A woman who kept almost everything private, saying the most essential true thing to the person she trusted most. She was not a woman who complained publicly, but she told her son the truth when it mattered. Her hair turned grey when she was 28 years old. It is one of those small physical facts that carries enormous emotional weight. The specific visible record of what sustained stress does to a body, the external sign of what a person is carrying inside. She was 28. She had a son who had survived brain surgery and was partially deaf. She had a husband who was becoming one of the most powerful and most wanted men in America. She was living in a household where violence was a professional tool and silence was the price of survival. Her hair went grey. Chicago, the empire, and the woman who lived beside it. The Chicago years, roughly from 1920 to 1931, were the years in which May Capone inhabited the most contradictory position imaginable. The family did not move to Chicago immediately after the marriage. May and Sonny stayed in Brooklyn for a few years, while Al established himself in the city, and it was not until approximately 1923 that they joined him there. The delay speaks to something about the practical arrangements of life in that world. Al was building the operation, getting the contacts established, creating the infrastructure of the criminal enterprise that would eventually generate the enormous revenues of the Prohibition years, and the family followed when the foundation was secure enough. When May and Sonny arrived in Chicago, they moved into a house on Prairie Avenue that Al shared with other members of the Capone family, a working arrangement that suited the specific communal living patterns of Italian immigrant families of the era. and that gave May a domestic world that was organized around family rather than isolation. She was the wife of the most powerful man in Chicago, with access to money that most people of her background could not have imagined. She decorated their Palm Island home in Florida lavishly. She drove a custom-designed convertible that Al had provided. She owned expensive jewelry. The life that the criminal empire provided was, in its material dimensions, extraordinary. It was also a life organized around daily contact with things she was not supposed to acknowledge. Al Capone ran the Chicago outfit through the Prohibition years with a combination of organizational intelligence and willingness to use violence that made him the dominant force in the city's illegal liquor trade, gambling operations, and other rackets. He was responsible for deaths, for the ordering of killings, for the use of violence as a regular business instrument. The 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in which 7 members of a rival gang were shot in a garage on the north side of Chicago, was widely attributed to the Capone organization, though Al was careful to be in Florida when it happened. May's husband was, by any honest accounting, a man who caused considerable suffering in the world beyond the suffering he caused at home. May knew some version of this. She would have had to be deliberately blind not to know it, and she was not a stupid woman. What she chose to do with that knowledge was to separate it from the private domestic world she inhabited. Al was Al at home. What Al was in the streets was not something she engaged with or discussed or allowed to contaminate the household she was running and the son she was raising. This was the specific survival mechanism of women in that world, the deliberate and continuous maintenance of a line between what you knew and what you acknowledged, between what the husband was professionally and what the wife was responsible for personally. She maintained that line across the entire arc of the Chicago years, through the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, and all the smaller episodes of violence that preceded and followed it, through the years when Al's face was on the front page of every newspaper in America, through the Senate hearings and the federal investigations and the mounting legal pressure that everyone in the orbit of the operation could see building. She went to Mass. She raised Sonny. She decorated the Palm Island home. She drove the custom convertible Al had given her. She was, to all external appearances, simply a wife and mother, living a comfortable life in a prosperous household. The gap between that appearance and the reality of what she was managing internally is the space where May Capone's actual story lives. The infidelities did not fit inside that separation. They were personal in a way that the criminal operation was not. They were about her, about the specific statement made by a husband who chooses other women consistently and without particular concealment. The disease she had contracted was the specific physical consequence of those choices. The children she had lost were the specific reproductive consequence. The emotional consequence was what she named to Sonny years later, in the most compressed and honest sentence she ever produced for the historical record. He broke my heart. The Palm Island estate in Florida, a magnificent property on a private island outside Miami, purchased by Al in the late 1920s, was the domain May made her own. She had the freedom to furnish and design it as she chose, and she chose well. She loved that house. It represented something, a home she had built rather than simply inherited, a space that carried her aesthetic judgment and her sense of what a family's environment should feel like. The jewelry that was eventually stolen in a burglary at the Palm Island home was irreplaceable, and its loss was one of the many small indignities of a life that delivered its gifts wrapped in costs. The fall, tax evasion, Alcatraz, and the years of vigil. The federal government's pursuit of Al Capone had been building for years before it finally produced a result. Elliot Ness and his team of investigators, the men who would eventually be immortalized in the press as the Untouchables, had been working to build a case around prohibition violations, trying to document the bootlegging operation in enough detail to prosecute it. They made some progress. They disrupted some of the breweries. They created problems for the organization at the operational level. But they could not build the kind of airtight criminal case that would send Capone to prison for the years that the government wanted. The IRS investigators took a different approach. They went into the financial records of the operation and began building a meticulous case around the money itself, specifically around the enormous income that Capone had received from his criminal enterprises and had not reported to the federal government for tax purposes. The legal theory was simple. Criminal income is still income, and failure to pay taxes on it is a federal crime. The investigative work was painstaking, requiring years of tracing cash flows through the complex arrangements that Capone's operation used to obscure its finances. But it worked. The federal government's pursuit of Al Capone succeeded not through the murder charges that might have been built, and that would have been the more obvious approach, and not through the prohibition violations that were the most visible dimension of his operation. It succeeded through his taxes. Treasury Department investigators built a case around what Capone had failed to do with his money, specifically, his failure to pay income tax on the income flowing through his operation. It was a technical solution to a spectacular problem. Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion in October 1931. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and ordered to pay back taxes and court costs. He was sent first to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and then, in August 1934, to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, on an island in San Francisco Bay, a mile and a half of cold Pacific water from the nearest shore, a facility designed specifically to hold the most difficult federal prisoners in conditions that minimized contact with the outside world. May's life reorganized entirely around the imprisonment. Everything that had structured the previous decade, the Palm Island home, the Chicago household, the social world that existed in proximity to Al's operation, the financial resources that the criminal empire generated, was suddenly organized around a different center of gravity. The fact that Al was behind bars and the life they had built together was now on hold indefinitely. The flow of money from the criminal organization had slowed and then largely stopped. The operation continued under other leadership, but it did not continue to support May and Sonny at the scale it had before. The organizational payments, the reported $600 a week, kept the basic arithmetic of their lives functional, but required May to manage the household with a careful attention to resources that the flush years had not demanded. She had always been the person who understood the family's practical situation. Now that understanding had to be applied with more discipline than before. The organization's leadership recognized that Capone behind bars was no longer an operational asset and potentially a liability, and they paid him a stipend, approximately $600 a week by some accounts, to stay quiet and stay away. May managed what remained. She tracked expenses. She maintained the Palm Island property. She preserved whatever financial stability the family still had against the mounting costs of lawyers, taxes, and ordinary living. She visited Al in Atlanta. She visited him at Alcatraz, which required considerably more from her. The trip from Florida was long. The ferry to the island was the only access point, and the visits were conducted under prison rules that limited what could be said and for how long. She went consistently. She was one of his most reliable visitors in a place where reliable visitors were rare. The loyalty she demonstrated in those years, visiting a man who had given her a disease, who had given her son a disease, who had broken her heart in a federal prison on an island in the Pacific, is the thing that makes her story genuinely difficult to reduce to a simple narrative. She also managed the press as carefully as she managed the finances. When speculation mounted about Al's mental deterioration inside Alcatraz, the odd behaviors, the confusion, the wearing of winter clothes in heated cells, May's public communications described him as being in a state of dejection and emotional distress, aggravated by the harsh conditions. What she carefully avoided saying was that his organs were being progressively destroyed by advanced syphilis that had been going untreated for years, and that his brain was being dismantled by a disease that had no cure available at that time, and that had been progressing since the early years of their marriage. The formal diagnosis, neurosyphilis, syphilis of the brain, was made in February 1938. May managed that information with the same deliberate care she had applied to everything about the marriage. She protected him from the press. She protected Sonny from the full weight of what was happening. She absorbed it herself. Al Capone was released from Alcatraz in 1939, transferred briefly to a prison hospital in California, and released entirely in November 1939, having served approximately 7.5 years. He spent time at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore receiving treatment before May brought him home to Florida. Palm Island, the long ending, and the grief she never showed. The man who came home to Palm Island in March 1940 was not the man who had left for prison in 1932. That man had been 32 years old and physically powerful, still possessed of the mental acuity that had made him the most feared man in Chicago, despite the beginnings of the disease. The man who returned was 40 years old. By clinical assessment, his brain was functioning at approximately the level of a 12-year-old child. The neurosyphilis had done what it does in its advanced stages. It had attacked the brain systematically and irreversibly, destroying the tissue that housed the personality and the intelligence and the memory and the judgment of the man May had married. He had conversations with people who were not there, talking to long-dead friends as though they were present in the room. He had moments of something like clarity, and then the clarity would dissolve. He needed constant supervision. He could not be left alone. May became his full-time caretaker, not in the delegated way of someone who arranges for professional nurses, but in the daily physical and emotional way of someone who has taken on the entire responsibility of another person's existence. She managed his medications. She managed his schedule. She kept reporters, who were circling the Palm Island estate constantly, hoping for a glimpse of the fallen gangster, away from him. She managed the specific humiliation of keeping private the fact that one of the most feared men in American history now wandered his Florida estate in confusion, unreachable by reason or memory. The mob had moved on. New figures had taken the positions Al had held. The organization had restructured around his absence with the efficient adaptability that successful criminal enterprises maintain, and he was not needed or consulted. He was a retired figure receiving a modest stipend, cared for by his wife on a private island in Florida, getting progressively worse. The arrival of penicillin in wider medical use in the early 1940s offered some partial relief. His physical symptoms improved with treatment, and there were periods of stabilization. But the damage to his brain was beyond what any treatment could reverse. By 1946, the clinical picture had not meaningfully changed. The man who had run the Chicago outfit, who had managed millions of dollars in criminal revenue, who had navigated the politics of organized crime with the intelligence of a natural executive, that man was gone. What remained was someone who needed May the way a child needs a parent. On January 21st, 1947, Al Capone had a stroke. He was 48 years old. He recovered briefly, enough for those around him to hope, but then developed pneumonia. He died on January 25th, 1947, at the Palm Island home, with May and Sonny and other family members at his side. He was buried first at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, and later moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, where he rests beside his father Gabriel and his brother Frank. May was 50 years old. She had been with him for more than half of her life. She had never given an interview. She had never published anything. She had never leveraged the specific currency of the Capone name for her own benefit. She had simply been there, through all of it, doing whatever being there required. After the death, the finances were what remained, diminished, carefully managed, the residue of a fortune that had been consumed by legal fees and taxes and medical expenses across 20 years of Al's legal troubles and illness. She and Sonny sold the Palm Island estate in 1952. The house she had decorated with such care, the domain that had been most specifically hers, was gone. The son, the lawsuits, and the long silence. Sonny Capone built his own life with the specific challenges of a person who carries one of the most infamous names in American history and is determined to live anyway. He was, in many respects, the most visible measure of what the marriage had cost May. The son who had been born with a disease his father gave him, who had survived brain surgery as a child, who had grown up partially deaf in a household where his father was first a bootlegger, then a prisoner, then a man being slowly consumed by neurological damage. Sonny was the person May had most consistently protected, from the moment she travelled from Chicago to New York for his medical care, through the years of managing the press scrutiny that surrounded the family, through the prison years when she tried to give him as normal a life as possible in the specific abnormal circumstances they inhabited. What Sonny had said about his mother in the rare interviews he gave across his adult life was consistent. She was devoted. She was strong. She was the center of the family in a way that his father, for all his power in the world outside the home, had never quite been inside it. The family's stability, to whatever extent stability was achievable in the specific conditions they were living in, was May's work. He changed his name legally to Brown for a period, not to abandon the family, but to create enough space from the notoriety to hold a job and move through the world without the name preceding him everywhere. He eventually returned to the Capone name. He worked in ordinary occupations, ran a restaurant in Florida, married, had 4 daughters, and stayed entirely clear of organized crime. May fought for Sonny and for Sonny's children with the same force she had applied to everything else. When the television series The Untouchables aired in 1959, the fictionalized account of Elliot Ness and Al Capone that renewed intense public fascination with the family. Sonny's daughters were bullied at their school because of the Capone name. May filed a lawsuit to protect her grandchildren from the harassment that a television program had made worse. She was 62 years old. The lawsuit did not produce significant legal results, but the filing itself was consistent with who she had always been, someone who would do whatever the situation required to protect the people she was responsible for, regardless of the likely outcome. She lived quietly in Florida for the remaining decades of her life. She did not give interviews in those decades. She did not sell a memoir. She did not sit down with any of the many journalists and documentary makers who would have paid well for an account of what the marriage had actually been like from the inside. She maintained, to the end, the specific privacy that had been her defining characteristic since she first appeared in the historical record as the young woman who adjusted the ages on her marriage certificate. Sonny Capone died in 2004 at the age of 85. He had outlived his father by 57 years. May had already been gone for 18 years by then. She died on April 16th, 1986, in Hollywood, Florida. She was 89 years old. She was buried beside Al at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Returned to the ground of the city that had defined the Capone name, beside the man she had never left. What the marriage actually cost. May Capone's hair went grey at 28. Her son was born with a disease her husband had given him. The disease likely contributed to the stillbirths and miscarriages that followed, taking the children she tried to have. She spent the prime years of her life managing the household of a man who was simultaneously one of the most dangerous criminals in America and one of the most consistently unfaithful husbands of his era. She spent years of her middle life visiting him in federal prison on an island in the Pacific. She spent the final years of his life as the full-time caretaker of a man whose brain had been destroyed by the disease he had transmitted to her, until he died at 48 and left her to manage what remained. She told her son his father had broken her heart. She never told anyone else anything. The word that has most often been applied to May Capone across the decades of writing about her life is loyalty. She was loyal. She demonstrated loyalty at a scale and across a duration that most people would have abandoned long before the finish. But loyalty by itself does not explain what she was doing or why. She was a Catholic woman from the specific tradition that understood marriage as a sacrament and a permanent covenant. She was a woman whose own father had died young and who had organized her identity from an early age around the role of the person who stays and manages and endures when others cannot. She was a woman who had constructed her entire adult life inside this marriage, and for whom the alternative, whatever form it might have taken, was not something the architecture of herself allowed her to fully consider. She also, by every account, genuinely loved Al Capone, not despite what he was, because of who he was to her specifically, the young man from Carroll Gardens who had charmed her family, who had given her Sonny, who had given her the house she loved, who had chosen her, in his particular way, above all the other women he had access to. He broke her heart. She also loved him. Both things were true at the same time, and she lived inside both of them simultaneously for nearly 7 decades. The marriage destroyed parts of her life that could not be recovered. The children she lost, the years of fear, the physical toll of the disease, the grey hair at 28, the Palm Island estate sold in 1952, the fortune consumed by the legal system. It also gave her the specific life she had, the son she raised, the grandchildren she protected with lawsuits and love in equal measure. May Capone died on April 16, 1986, in Hollywood, Florida. She was 89 years old. She had survived the empire, the trials, the prison years, the caregiving, and 39 years of quiet Florida life, and she left without having given anyone outside the family a true account of what all of it had looked like from where she was standing. That silence was not weakness. It was the specific kind of strength that takes a lifetime to build and that very few people ever fully manage to hold. What May Capone's life ultimately demonstrates is something that the standard narratives of organized crime tend to skip past in their focus on the men at the center of the action. The women who lived inside those worlds paid costs that were real and permanent and not chosen, and they paid them without the recognition or the resources or the public sympathy that might have made the paying easier. They were expected to be loyal, and they were loyal, and the loyalty was taken as simply what wives in that world did. Unremarkable, expected, not particularly worth examining. May Capone deserves to be examined. The girl from Carroll Gardens who graduated from high school when girls in her situation rarely did, who went to work in a factory at 16 to keep her family intact, who fell in love with the wrong man and stayed with him through everything the wrong man produced. She was a person of genuine intelligence and genuine endurance, and the specific shape her life took was not simply the passive result of what Al Capone did. It was also the active result of what she chose. day after day, across 68 years of marriage and widowhood, to do with what she had been given. She chose to protect her son. She chose to protect Al, even when he did not protect her. She chose silence over exposure, dignity over complaint, endurance over whatever the alternatives might have been. Those choices had costs. They also had a kind of integrity that is worth recognizing. May Capone died on April 16th, 1986, in Hollywood, Florida. She was 89 years old. She outlived the empire, the trials, the prison, the caregiving, and the man who had broken her heart by 39 years. She left nothing for the historical record but the facts, the dates, the addresses, the medical records of a son's surgery, the marriage certificate where both their ages had been adjusted to 20. That is enough. It is, in fact, more than most people leave. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.